Good morning. This is Dr. Mark Christians from the Dordt University Psychology Department, and it's a pleasure to be with the Intro Psych students to kind of talk through what's it like to be a client in a counseling situation or in a therapy situation. So I'm going to kind of go through and focus on kind of the beginning of that process, what leads a person to reach out for help, what that looks like, and what the steps also would look like when they begin therapy with a counselor. So I really need to say that it takes a lot of courage for a person to recognize that they do need help. There could be an experience of depression or anxiety, or maybe they're reflecting on past experiences with abuse or sexual assault. Whatever the circumstance is, it takes a lot of courage to reach out and talk to somebody and find help, professional help, with the therapist. So it oftentimes begins with a phone call and trying to find a therapist. I won't get into all the details of how you go about doing that, but there's a lot of good resources online, but also word of mouth, getting to know the community who has a good reputation as a therapist. And even before that person makes a phone call to make an appointment, typically there's several people, friends, family members, coworkers, people from their church, that probably have spoken into that person's life to say, hey, have you thought about talking to somebody? Have you thought about seeing a counselor? And oftentimes it takes several of those encouragements to lead a person to actually pick up the phone and dial the number and make an appointment. Let's jump to the scenario that the person has made the appointment. They arrive at the agency. Typically it's a fairly standard office, kind of similar to a medical office with a waiting room. Once you arrive, you're likely going to begin to fill out some paperwork, which would be a client intake form. And I'll talk through kind of a basic, generic example with this one in a few minutes. So the office setup, fairly simple, depending on how many counselors. It could be a combined agency where you have medical doctors and counselors, so it could be a variety of professionals that share that space. So once the person arrives, then they will fill out typically some paperwork. This is a fairly lengthy example that I found online, but it certainly gives a lot of contact information, client's name, address, phone number, employer, if they're married, spouse's name and contact, and so forth. And then it goes into some disclosures about therapy related to confidentiality. How is that going to be handled? Then it gets into some of the financial obligations, fee policy. This kind of varies from agency to agency, how they handle the finances and whether or not that's actually included in the intake form. This one it is. It talks a little bit about insurance. Sometimes your employer may have insurance coverage that will pay for part, or if not all, of your counseling services. And then it gets into some of the more detailed information about the client himself or herself. So asking about life, family, and relationship information, whether or not they're married, whether or not they have children, the children's names, ages, gender. And then it gets into the reason for seeking out therapy. And to me, this is probably one of the most important parts of the intake form, to find out what has led them to come to a counselor to seek out help. So it gives them space to elaborate on the reasons for seeking therapy. Then it gives them a bit of a symptom checklist to say, these are the kinds of things I've been experiencing in the last week or two or three. Ask a little bit about your medical history, substance use, whether or not you drink, caffeine, smoke, have high blood pressure. Typically there's a fairly standard also medical checklist on there as well. Then one of the more common parts of an intake form would be family of origin history. So getting information on mother, father, if they're still living, what their occupation is, what their health is at the time, whether or not they're still living, and then siblings. And then also maybe, depending on the intake form, they could ask for any kinds of life events that may have been a part of your family of origin. Could be divorce, drug abuse, physical abuse, emotional problems, legal troubles, those types of things. Then there's a section typically asking about your spiritual background and sort of religious background, and maybe even asking questions about, do you pray, or how often do you read the Bible. This particular generic example I'm using, I don't think is coming from necessarily a Christian counseling agency, but depending on kind of the background of the therapist, then they would typically ask about that. And then finally, some things on employment, and then whether or not you've had a previous experience with a therapist, which then leads to one of the things that might come up in an intake form is that if the client's had a previous counselor, and sometimes they may have had more than one previous counselor, then typically if I'm seeing this person now in a new therapy relationship, it would be helpful for me to know, what were the issues that you were working on, and I could request for records from that previous therapist. But the key thing is I can't ask for any information on the client without their permission. So there's a release of information form that they would sign to give me permission to seek out forms and information from a previous therapist, and the client has complete control over all of that information. So they can even designate the type of information that I can get, whether or not this is going to be a one-time request or if it's kind of an open date type of thing where I'm gathering some information. So that's a little bit about the intake form. And then once I would sit down with a client for the first time, they've completed the paperwork, I've had a chance to review all the information on the intake form, so I have a bit of a sense of the person's primary issues, what's brought them in here, a little bit on their background and so forth. And then I might sort of take one or two aspects of that intake form and begin a dialogue. Oftentimes could begin with what led them to come to therapy, which then will typically lead to stories or anecdotes about symptoms or difficulties. And then I'll begin to just kind of build, not only build the story, but build a relationship with the client to hopefully increase trust, increase empathy, that I can understand and hear their experience and their story. And then beyond that, really what I'm trying to do is simply observe. And sitting 2-3 feet away from another person, you can observe behaviors, mannerisms, facial expressions, their appearance. How are they dressed? Are they speaking rapidly? Are they speaking slowly? Are they animated? Is their motor movement more slow? Looking for and paying attention to thought processes and feelings and those types of things. So really it's just a full kind of observation for 50 minutes or an hour in that first session, trying to get a sense of who is this person, what is their primary concern, and then really the key question that I'm trying to move toward the end of that first intake session is to ask the question, what are your primary goal or goals in your therapy experience with me? What do you want to work on? And then I can begin to kind of sketch out, maybe they have 2 or 3 things, maybe they have more than that, and then having a dialogue about which ones of those they want to work on first, and lays a little bit of the foundation for the types of issues, the types of change that they're looking for, and then it might simply end with making another appointment. And depending on how they feel, whether or not they felt heard, whether or not they feel like this is a safe place to tell their story, then they likely would make another appointment. If it's not a crisis situation where there could be risk of suicide or hospitalization, I certainly would maybe wait a week or so before seeing them again. But if there's an intense crisis type of thing, then obviously I would not let them leave. If they're currently suicidal, I would need to consult a hospital or a psychiatrist, and maybe even law enforcement if the person is not willing to seek out help. So that's a little bit of the kind of the beginning through that first intake dialogue with a counselor. Really it's a conversation, and oftentimes there's kind of mysterious kind of, what really happens in a counseling office. It's not that spooky. We're not, the person's not laying on the couch talking about their dreams or anything like that. but yet it's two people trying to have a dialogue, and for the therapist to get to know that person well enough to build a relationship and to build a sense of care for them as a child of God, wanting them to kind of move toward restoring health, physical health, mental health, relational health, spiritual health, and doing that over a series of, could be 3 sessions, could be 8 sessions, could be 20 sessions. It really depends on the severity of the issues, whether or not you're making progress toward those goals, and doing that together in a comprehensive way. So I just want to wish you guys all the best as you adjust to all these unique times that we're living in right now with the pandemic, and hopefully you're staying healthy yourself and making progress on your online courses. Thanks for popping into this video, and hope it was helpful. And maybe if Dr. Helming receives any follow-up questions from you guys based on this video, I'd be happy to come back and maybe do a Zoom meeting with you guys if that would be helpful. All right, have a good day.